Welcome to episode 407 of the Barcelona podcast, brought to you by the Blue Wire Podcast Network. I'm Dan Hilton, and joining me again is none other than the Purist, or Jaleel, as I'll be calling him for the rest of the show. Now, Jaleel, we booked the show weeks before Gerard Pique announced his retirement. He did not tell us in advance that he was going to drop that less than 24 hours before our show. So as a point of order, we'll be doing all of that next week, the whole deep dive on his legacy, whether he's a legend, whether his legacy has been tarnished by the last few months even, or the prior few seasons in Europe and all those things. So he will be playing his final game in front of the Camp Nou faithful this weekend against Almeria. And then Xavi did announce in his press conference today that his last official game in the squad is going to be against Osasuna. And then he is going to ride off in the sunset and take the 30 million euros. Well, he's not actually taking it with him. He's going to leave those 30 million euros that Barca owe him this year, and he's going to leave that behind. So doing a service to the club and likely setting himself up for a political move to be a president in the future. And then we also have that little caveat about you cannot have, what was it? It's some kind of, I have to look at what the law is. I'll have that all for you next week, but something about you cannot have certain capital if you're a professional athlete, and you can't have certain, it's about conflicts of interest, and the Spanish law is changing. Oddly enough, timing, pretty serendipitously with him announcing his retirement. So there's a lot of things at play that we're definitely going to get into next week. But for now, Jaleel, I think, the big picture is just that Gerard Pique has announced his retirement, and it's a little bit of a shock to the squad, but also it isn't, because it sounds very premeditated between Xavi and Pique and Laporta, and it sounds like they had a pretty good idea when this was going to be announced.
Yeah, it did. Perhaps a little bit sooner than we expected. I think it was probably the idea was for this to happen at the end of the season. It's happened now, and it's happened in a slightly strange moment, really, when Barca have been very much down on centre backs, and he's had to become a part of the team, not through really merit, but because of circumstance. But it will leave Barca one centre back down for the rest of the season, and I think Xavi's talked already in his press conferences about potentially having to fill that gap now, which creates a mid-season problem. Probably wouldn't have been in their planning. But regardless, yeah, PK, I was sad on the announcement video. I really was, because, aside from this season, he's really been at the fulcrum of what has made this team great for so many years. And he is undoubtedly a legend in my eyes. And yeah, to see a lot of the slander and the poisonous comments towards him over the past few weeks. Sure, his performances haven't been great, but you can't be so narrow-sighted and forget what he's given to this club. Regardless, it will be an emotional one on Saturday, I would assume, when he does play his last game, and it's going to be sad to see him go.
Yeah, I mean, he's such a character, right? He's such a larger-than-life figure. That's why he's certainly one that you're not going to miss. There are those legends that they slink off and they disappear completely. Actually, Puyol's been much more front-facing than I thought he would be as an agent and on social media and things like that, even getting himself in a little bit of trouble with Casillas recently. But for Pique, he's going to be in our lives. There's no way that anybody who follows the club, or not even FC Barcelona, but Spanish football in general. And I mean, he's going to have businesses or things the like, and marketing and whatever, and he'll be up in our faces in the English speaking world, in the Spanish speaking world, and all the different ways. But yeah, I agree with that too. As far as longevity, and I think that's where I want to kind of take my time with this announcement as well, because he has been a member of the first team for 14 years. He's been at the academy since he was 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, or that's at least when he and Messi met, that great 1987 class with Fabregas and Messi and the like. And Victor Sanchez. And so, to see how far he's come, he's been in my life for almost half of my life, if that makes any sense, right?
Yeah.
So it's been a long time. And I think a lot of the hate you're seeing are, not to say kids, but are people who've not actually, who can't conceptualize or understand just how long he's been around and the longevity of that career. Because, as we always say, the hardest thing to do for an athlete isn't to be great, it's to be great over a long amount of time, which makes what even Messi's doing this season completely make our brains melt. And the same with Pique, where he was very good for a very long time. And that is, again, hard to conceptualize because you're just going to remember him holding his hands up against Inter. But I don't think that's going to be the case for me. Certainly. And I actually want to, before next week, I want to go back and I want to watch some of his best performances and some of Barca's best performance and kind of be able to speak to what he should be remembered at as opposed to what he in recent memory he'll be remembered as. But either way, so Pique, that's next week. Now, what's also next week is Monday. There is going to be the announcement on the Europa League opponent that Barcelona have. It is one of 8 opponents. It is Manchester United. It is Midtjylland from Denmark. It is Nantes from France. It is Monaco from France. Well, from Monaco. It is PSV from Netherlands. It is Union Berlin from Germany. It is Stade Rennes from France. And it is Roma, of course, Mr. Mourinho from Italy. Those are all the potential opponents for FC Barcelona. And I think people are already starting the whole thing about, it definitely is going to be Manchester United. Of course, it's going to be Manchester United, right? Because that is where the narrative is shaping. But of those opponents, Jaleel, who are you most curious to potentially see? Who do you have a gut feeling that it'll be?
I do have a gut feeling it'll be United, just because of the way everything's panned out so far in Europe this season.
Sure.
But honestly, you know, in terms of quality, and we're going to talk about that a bit later, but the qualitative issues that the team has had in big Champions League games won't be the case against any of these teams. On paper, in terms of field quality, Barca will have an advantage. Um, I'm not familiar with all of those teams, so I can't dive into tactically, who would be most interesting or anything like that. But I can say for certain that now there is no excuse. And so, regardless of the opponent, we should be looking at a set of fixtures that Barca are more than capable of winning. And that's the bottom line for me. And so I'm looking forward to whatever the draw is, even if it's United. I think based on what Ten Hag is doing, because I am more familiar with his tactical ideas, he's doing something very similar to Xavi, and he's just slightly further behind in the project with less quality. So that would actually be a fixture that Barca would probably have a big advantage in. Um, but for the rest of the teams, or for all of them, I can't say. But yeah, down to quality, we should be looking at some positive results for sure.
Well, yeah, when it comes to United, I think that is certainly where the biggest draw would be. That would be where we would have the most conversations, where the most to kind of, well, at least set yourself as a checkpoint, as a marker as to where the project is, certainly because of what Man United means to the world football and how big of a club, I say that tongue in cheek, but how big of a club United is. And, I think the one team I, not that I don't want to see, but like for me, Roma, with Mourinho, there is nothing about that I find to be enjoyable or to consider, or to, it's not even the Mourinho factor. It's even another team from Serie A. Again, none of that seemed enjoyable to me more than I'd rather see, PSV with the Xavi Simons and Luke de Jong, and the fact that PSV are pretty up and down, and they have an ability to open up games, but they don't necessarily have a strong ability to handle counterattacks either. So I think guys like Dembele, it would be really, really interesting to watch that kind of matchup. And then Union Berlin, they are a team, I've got to see them 1 or 2 times this year, and they are a lot about the vibes. They're I don't know how to explain. I don't know how to describe a team as loud, but that's what I want to go to. They're a loud team, if you will. Like things happen, and things kind of now for over a year, things shake and bake with them. And I also would want to see Rennes. As people know, in the past, when I've kind of looked at where Barcelona should be looking at in transfer markets, they should be looking at teams, I think, that play a similar style. And in France, even though the results aren't really there for Lyon are a very similar team. Rennes is a very similar team. So when I look at younger players that potentially might fit at Barcelona, I do look at those kind of teams, like a Lyon, like a Rennes, who do generally play 4-3-3 positional play, very similar to what Xavi's trying to do. And so a team like Rennes is very interesting to me because, I think that is where Xavi might be able to look across and say, hey, again, it's like our project, but we have more quality, therefore we should take care of business. But maybe one of those 2 players can impress and potentially in the future. Then Midtjylland is really interesting in Denmark because of their project. They've kind of been piecing it together through years. They know they don't have the budget, but they were really, really, really well. I don't know how many reelers I have to, but they're really, really, really well-run club. Not even team, not even manager, but they're a well-run club. And I always like to see how Barcelona, again, who to say that they're not run well, I think they've been run poorly in the previous regime, and Laporta, as I still think, filling out his report card. But for Barcelona, that are seen as a club that's in utter incomplete chaos, I think it is an interesting juxtaposition to see a club that is so opposite to them, and as far as being run really, really well. So, all right. Anyway, Jaleel, now we're 10 minutes in, so it's time to really focus up, get into tactic talk. That's why you're here. And I think where we begin is not necessarily with one individual player, but with a concept and a video that you came out with last week about Barcelona's decisions in the final third. And so we're not talking necessarily about one individual match. I know it feels like Victoria Pilsen was years ago, and I don't know how much we really garner from there. But when we're talking about the results of recent weeks, whether it was Villarreal, whether it was Valencia, whether it was Athletic Club, I mean, because again, Villarreal and Athletic Club, Barcelona went out and smacked them around. And it seems like with Xavi's plan and positional play and all that, not saying he's not doing anything different, but the ideas against Villarreal and Athletic Club that work are the same ideas that seem to not work when it comes to Bayern Munich or against Inter Milan. And it didn't really even work for Valencia until that final moment there. So at the core of that, I think, is chance creation and decisions in the final third. And I think the name would begin there. I kind of want to just give you room to speak your truth about this, and that is Ousmane Dembele and how his decisions in the final third and Barcelona's chance creation and their success is just it's an A to B equation there.
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, you look at the athletic game in particular. Um, a lot of the joy that Barca get against a lot of teams in La Liga is those that really think they can give them a go. So, typically teams that play four at the back with a sort of mid to high line, um, and they can get very much exploited if by Barcelona's positional system, very wide, isolating the wingers against the fullbacks in space. And invariably at the end of the attacks is your winger in space, 1v1, which is usually Dembele. So the athletic game, the reason why I mentioned that is because in essentially the first two or three attacks, he's got a goal and assist. Um, he got an assist to Lewandowski, cutting from right to left when he opened himself into space against the fullback, and he got an assist into who was it? Sergio Roberto, who was making an underlapping run, and that is the game plan in a nutshell when Dembele's on form. It happened as well for the fourth goal. There was some build-up play on the left, out to Dembele, cuts it back to Ferran Torres, and that's great if Dembele is on form, making the good decisions, getting into good goal scoring situations, and executing. When Dembele isn't, and we know that that is certainly possible in a lot of games, then you very much lose your plan A. And against Bayern, the Bayern game is a bit weird. Obviously, Bayern are a very good team. You can't expect to have a lot of chances. But Barca were getting into the final third, and it was simply a case of players giving the ball away or making poor decisions that led to attacks breaking down. The system really was nothing different or not particularly faulty compared to Athletic, Villarreal, whatever. You're up against greater quality, and therefore you need to step up. And we've seen that Dembele, unfortunately, on occasions hasn't stepped up. Is there a plan B? Well, it's an interesting one because, how much do you want to deviate your core philosophy and the things that are working well in the league because a guy can't turn up? It's a really tough one to say. You don't want to, completely rejig everything, assuming that we know Dembele is going to play poorly this weekend, so we have to do something completely different. That's you can't really do that as a manager. Or you can, and that involves investing not in this Dembele receives wide system, but you change it, permanently, or you give more prominence to a player like Raphinha, for example, which is why I wanted to make that other video I've made recently on Raphinha.
Which we'll get into in a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think the conclusion that a lot of people have come to on the back of all of this, the good performances in the league and the poor performances when the opposition becomes better, is that maybe Dembele isn't good enough at the elite level. And I think the jury's still out on that. I'm not 100% sure, but certainly it's not a difference in the system. It's not a difference in how the team plays. It purely is a difference in performance. And how do you account for that other than get somebody who's better? And I don't want to be the guy who rules out Dembele forever. Clearly, his ceiling is so high But if you can't rely on him to consistently perform at the highest level, which is what any elite team is based on, players that can consistently perform at a high level, like we're talking about with Pique, and like has been the case with guys in previous Barca teams, guys like Pedro, who, you know, might not have had the highest ceiling in the world like Dembele does, but could consistently perform even against elite opposition. He could beat a man, he could make the right decisions, he understood what his role was. If you
And
don't have that, just to finish, sorry, if you don't have that, consistency at the elite level, then I'm not sure you can make it long term in a club that has aspirations to win the Champions League.
yeah, and I think that was one of the huge differences between Fabregas when he came into that midfield with Busquets and Iniesta and Xavi. Why Fabregas just didn't seem to be at the same level. It's that his ceiling was, not to say it was just below, it wasn't as high, but it certainly was high enough. Like Fabregas in his prime was very much good enough for any Barcelona team. But as you said, he was not consistent enough, and he would have those weird matches in the Liga, or he'd have a weird performance in the Champions League where the consistency wasn't there, and that is why Fabregas remembered the way he is as opposed to the others. For sure, I think he fits in that category. Then Pedro is a great example. That as you said, Pedro. I mean, how high was his ceiling? But his ceiling was always high enough to show up, and he scored in Champions League finals. And some of
Mm,
Barcelona's best performances were him on the left, and not Thierry Henry or not David Villa. In those situations. So, and speaking of continuing the idea of wingers, so I think it was really smart what you pointed out in multiple videos now about the first touch of those forwards, especially those wingers, and where they take themselves. And
mm,
Dembele, as you said, does have a habit where he receives that diagonal ball, and if he takes himself farther out and wide, he limits his own opportunities. It's either he really does beat the man, but now he's already getting doubled, and we've seen that a lot. Teams have wisened up, and so they bring that help, whether it's defensive midfielder or if there's a mobile enough center back on the other side, or if, I mean, we can also do this soon, is whether it's four at the back or five at the back is a lot different. Where if it's four at the back, that means that defensive midfielder on the opposite side has got to either leave Gabi or leave Pedri and drop into double Dembele, or Dembele is going to get around the one left back that's kind of sitting on their own, and you're going to have to hope that your center back comes over in time. And if so, then that leaves Lewandowski with a 1v1 with the other center back. And so it becomes a numbers game when it's four at the back. When the other team has five at the back, they can, without hesitation, bring that left center back over to Dembele and stop any idea that he might have to go around the left back or to come inside even. And he knows that he's going to meet at least one or two other men waiting to take the ball away, and Dembele is going to dribble himself into trouble. And so, as you mentioned, especially against those five at the backs, when he receives and pushes the ball forward farther out to the wing, he limits his own opportunities. And he also sometimes will receive it too heavy, and he'll push it forward, and he'll immediately lose the ball. And while he is losing the ball in a position where, again, it's the final third of the opposite team, where it's not really hurting Barca on the counter if they're able to get in position and set up their press, which they, again, we'll also get into this, where they've done actually pretty well at doing this season, the way that Xavi has built that press. And that is one of the things that has seen positive progress, is the press at Barcelona since Xavi took over, as opposed to where with Koeman, I mean, the personnel was a little bit different, but the form and the formation just were not what it needed to be. And then Ansu on the other side, I think it was very interesting that you also pointed out that Ansu tends to have his first touch let him down as well, where either is this season taking an extra dribble that he didn't used to, or he's receiving it and he's taking himself out wide, and Ansu doesn't physically, he's not, and not that they'd say that he ever was, but he's not the player that's going to go around the opposition, that's going to dribble to the touchline and then cross it in. That's not what Ansu wants to do. And so if his first touch doesn't take him in field at the right angle, then it's not necessarily going to get the job done. And as you kind of also compared Ansu with other elite scorers, he's taking himself too wide, and that shot is not one that he's comfortable with just yet. It might come in time, but because he's narrowing his shooting angle, he's either not in form or not prepared to shoot from that angle and finish the play and score those goals. So unless his first touch is taking himself far enough in field where he's setting himself up, then Ansu is kind of negating his own best qualities as well. Again, which is kind of what Dembele is doing. So I thought that was really interesting. And then comparing that to Lewandowski, noticing even if Lewandowski's touch is heavy at times, because it can be, especially when he has his back to goal, his touch can be heavy. But when he is running downhill and receiving a pass from some kind of through ball or diagonal ball, you can tell the difference between an elite finisher in Lewandowski and then a Dembele and Ansu. Again, Raphinha, I'm kind of putting him off to the side for now, but Dembele and Ansu, immediately comparing the two, the Lewandowski consistently sets himself up as to where he is comfortable getting a shot off, and more often than not, he scores those shots, especially in the Liga. So I threw a lot out there, but if there's anything you have to add on Ansu, and then again, what Lewandowski is even doing right this season, consistently setting himself up to be the leading goal scorer in the Liga.
Yeah, I think it's about, keeping your options open and going back to Dembele, and his first touch and his decision making when he receives the ball. And you could actually link it to a common theme or a common problem with the team in general, which is that the emphasis on immediately creating a dangerous action, immediately creating threat. Um, and one of the other principles that it talks about in that video on decision making was delaying your decision is actually sometimes as beneficial as, immediately committing to something. So when Dembele takes a heavy touch on the touchline and commits himself to a dribble, he's prevented Barca potentially establishing a passing move in the final third that could have resulted in a greater chance than him, trying to take on three players. And I suppose the same goes for Ansu on the left. If you're being too direct, there's nothing wrong with being a direct player, of course, it's important to a great threat. But if you're doing it every time, you limit your own potential for the team to create better chances. Um, and yeah, the example that I made in that video was Pedri, who is probably the best at it. He very rarely, although presented with good opportunities, and some fans get a bit annoyed about this, but even if he has a good opportunity to hit, a diagonal ball or a through ball or whatever, he'll usually delay his decision. And 9 times out of 10, that actually creates a better opportunity for himself. Completely the opposite mentality to Dembele. And I think in general, aside from his, on and off ability to beat a player or commit or execute the final pass, another thing that holds Dembele back is by committing to these dribbles, these threatening actions, the team just don't keep the ball well enough. And against the more elite opposition, like Bayern, for example, the more you give the ball away, it's much, much harder to get it back than it is against, most La Liga opponents. So every single time you lose the ball, the relative problem is increased greatly, um, because it might be another 5, 10 minutes before you get the ball back. That's why the most polished positional play side on the planet, Man City, their wingers are incredible ball retention specialists. Very rarely give the ball away, in a deep position, because it allows City to establish possession in the final third, put together passing moves, and keep the opponent pinned there. If you're giving it away too much, you just don't give yourself the opportunity to do so. So it's a two-pronged issue, when we're talking about, that first touch and that emphasis on driving forward. One, you don't get it right all the time, and two, you don't give your team the chance to settle in possession.
Well, for Pedri, of course, that word we have in Spanish is pausa. And that's something that Iniesta did almost better than everyone else. That's why I always tell people, as enjoyable, yes, of course, Messi is magical. And Xavi was, I think, not say the better player, but more influential to games. Iniesta is always the player I point to and say, that was the guy that I enjoyed watching the most and always will. Like, that's the first guy I would always want to show some kind of alien that would come down and say, who do you want to see? And I would point to Iniesta, because it was kind of like Pedri had a similar quality. And it is kind of like getting in a taxi or a ride share, where within the first two stoplights, maybe that's because I'm always the driver in our car with my wife. So I'm always a driver, so I know kind of what I want. I'm a very safe driver, and I pride myself on being a good driver too. So within the first 2 or 3 stoplights, I know whether or not saying that I'm in good hands, because you never want to be in a dangerous position. But I always know when the driver is somebody that you feel like it's seamless, right? They're stopping when they need to. They're rolling into the stops. They're you know what I mean? They're not turning too sharply or whatever, and it's just a comfortable ride, right? And that is what Pedri is. It's not stop and start. It's gliding into slowing things down. It's speeding up when it needs to be. And that's something that, I think as a Kool-Aid, you kind of pride yourself on having players that have just an innate elite ability to do that. It does feel like you're on the ride with your team. And it feels like the other team, if they get a counterattacking goal, I mean, that's football, but you always feel like that's what keeps Barcelona in control, is that they're choosing when things are slowed up, when things are slowed down. And for Pedri, he just does that at such an elite level. And then, I don't need to finish that analogy, but of course, you get in that car and 3 stoplights in, I'm like, oh no, like I'm gonna get whiplash. You get a headache because of how much. And when you finally get out of the car, you just, oh, thank goodness, we're on solid ground again. And sometimes that is kind of the Dembele experience. Sometimes at 90 minutes in, you're like, oh my gosh, Barcelona won 4-0, 4-1, right? And it's whiplash, and that's what it can be sometimes. So speaking of those wingers, though, Raphinha. And I'm going to I want to give you the room to, if you want to give away most of your video, if not, but why has Raphinha been sputtering, I think is the question. And then you gave multiple reasons, starting with his passing, as you argued, might be more important than his shooting and his scoring, which he does only have 1 goal, though. So it's not like his scoring has been utterly significant.
Yeah, but more important than his dribbling as well, which is the important part, because when we talk about, when I mentioned earlier about the plan really to get it over to Dembele and then he dribbles and creates, threat. If you just plug Rafinha into the same situation, he's going to fare worse than Dembele because he's a poorer dribbler. What Rafinha gives you that's very different is a very threatening passing range. And in that video, I likened it to Messi, and because he can execute a very similar type of pass from right to left, which can be devastating. One thing that I said in that decision-making video of mine and final third actions is that generally a pass into space is more dangerous than a dribble into space.
Can you repeat that, Julio? I just almost repeat the exact same sentence again. I just want to make sure people hear that. It's like the highlight of the episode.
Yeah, so a pass into space is more dangerous than a dribble into space. And the reason for that is you can access it quicker. A pass can get there quicker than a man can run. And you can beat multiple players at once, whereas with a dribble, you're beating one at a time. You can also get players running in on the blind side of defenders. It's just a much more efficient way of accessing space in the final third. And, that's why now, when the game is so positional and teams are so well organized, Messi is still at the top of the sort of creating charts because he is the best passer in the world. And he can access space that very few other players can. Now, Rafinha is obviously not Messi, but he has a similar passing range, and I'm sure he's not as consistent, but he's pretty damn consistent. We've seen from whether it's from a wide left position or from the half space or even deeper, his assist to Pablo Torre, for example, against in the Champions League. He can be very, very effective. The question is, how do you get him in those positions more often? And that was the basis of that video that I made. And it essentially comes down to changing the emphasis, like we talked about, away from isolating your winger wide, 1v1 against the fullback, to actually giving them the freedom to come inside. You still need that width though. And that's the problem that Barca has right now, is that on the right-hand side, who's going to hold the width if you give Raphinha license to be more of a Messi creative type? You need a Dani Alves. So who's the Dani Alves? And right now there isn't one.
No, there's not. There is not. I mean, even Sergio, the fact that we've been multiple times this season saying, "Oh, Sergio Roberto," I mean, he's the best option to make those underlapping runs, and I mean, occasionally overlapping runs. But again, I've been very critical of the partnership between Dembele and Roberto. While neither of them have been on the field together for more than 3 weeks until this season, but even this season, Roberto has been out again, and Dembele has been largely healthy. And now, kind of moving over to Bayern, and the reason I want to go all the way back to Bayern is because even though the Champions League is done and it's in the rear view mirror, this team is consistently going to be judged this season on what they do against the best opponents that they have left, whether that's in the Europa League against somebody down the road or even against potentially Manchester United or Roma or Monaco or whatever. And this team is also going to be judged again when their backs are against the wall or when a team kind of figures them out in the Liga, which could be with 5 at the back, and they have to break that down. But again, the best version of a team that Barca have seen this season, no disrespect to Inter or Real Madrid, but that was Bayern Munich. But you kind of went in a different direction with this and said, you and I were kind of setting this show up and trying to figure out, how we discuss this. And I think it is discussing that against Bayern Munich, you were optimistic about what Xavi was putting forward and his plan in that game and what Barcelona did execute. But the problematic part of it was, I think, what, as people who listen to the show after heard me or my five headlines or whatever, the drop in quality and the fact that Bayern just have these elite players who fill their roles to an absolute T was just better than what Barca can put on the field. And sometimes that is the difference. That is the gap between two teams. But yeah, there's different ideas here we can go, Jaleel. I can offer up to you, breaking Bayern's press by having Pedri on the left wing. We can talk about that. How Barca's press actually gave Bayern a little bit of trouble. How Bayern was utilizing tactical fouls, which you might say is the coward's way out, but they did. And then also what Barcelona does playing against a high line, and how Bayern kind of triggered their press against Barcelona, had a little bit of success. But I think the bigger question for that as well, when teams are going to press well, which Atletico, believe it or not, tried to do in the same way, then Barcelona completely figured them out. But what happens when Ronaldo Araujo is integrated back in? And I mean, because we've seen different teams have different activations against Barcelona's press, with the exception of prior to Ronaldo Araujo going out, where Araujo receiving the ball is generally the activation, whether that's to actually give him space to either drive forward or to try to pass and break through lines, or they actually do press against Araujo and they bring, intensity and force his way to kind of force him into a mistake and force him to go backwards to Ter Stegen and create a problem, especially when he's at the right back spot. So I think while questions against Bayern are going to be left unanswered, there are also questions that their success against Bayern do leave, I think, up for grabs later on down the road when someone like Araujo returns.
Yeah, I got a fair amount of criticism for that Bayern analysis, and I completely understand why. You lose a game 3-0 in the Champions League,
Yeah.
and you sort of want, especially if you're passionate about your club, you sort of want them to be berated and say, look how bad we are compared to them. We should be much better.
And that's a shame too, Jill, because I have never once in all these years ever received any negative feedback at all. It's incredible. No, you
Yeah.
just see my Twitter mentions or my YouTube the YouTube comments maybe worse. And again, you're on YouTube too, so I can tell you that's say the worst of the worst. But when it comes to Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, or my emails, even the emails are the ones I'm proud of. When I get one in the inbox that's like,
Oh
hey,
yeah.
I took the time to find your email to let you know that you're a big old dummy. So, Jill, I don't think you're a dummy. You didn't get any bad stuff from me, but yeah, let's get back into it.
Yeah. I completely get it. The point that I was trying to make was not that Barca were better or should have won the game. Of course not. The point was that they were competitive and that tactically, when we've seen Barca lose to Bayern in the past in embarrassing fashions, they've just been playing a backwards brand of football. Whereas this time they actually matched Bayern tactically for a lot of the game. And yes, in my opinion, it did come down to moments of quality because Bayern's goals in particular happened in moments of Barca's advantage, really. The idea for Barca was to put pressure on Bayern so that they had to go back all the way to the goalkeeper and kick long. And when they did kick long, Bayern had the quality to actually worm their way out of it and then exploit the space in behind. You made a point about Araujo being back in the team, and he would have significantly improved Barca's chances against these long balls or these direct forward passes. Koundé is obviously a very good and patient defender who controls space very well, but 1 versus 1 up against a physical centre forward, he's not the biggest. He's not going to come through the back of you like De Ligt was going through the back of Lewandowski, and so Araujo greatly increases Barca's chances of that press succeeding. Now, that sort of leads on to what I consider to be the most interesting talking point when it came to Bayern, because if we're going to concede that the team has less quality, should the coach be changing his system or ideas to account for that, and not play into the opponent's hands and play a high line against the likes of Mane and Gnabry, who are going to eat you alive? Because in the league, Barca have the qualitative advantage against basically every team except Real Madrid, which means you can play your system and control the game and you're not going to get exploited. When you're at a qualitative disadvantage, is there a question that Xavi should perhaps be a little more conservative? Should he have given Bayern more possession? Should he have allowed them to have more control so that they have to actually break you down rather than exploit, a very high line at the back? And I think that question is still up for debate. I don't think there's a clear answer either way. Because if you do give Bayern more possession, if you say, okay, we're actually going to let you, you know, move the ball to the halfway line and then we're going to sit back in a shape. When do Barca ever sit back in a shape? Do you trust Marcus Alonso and Sergio Roberto and whoever else to defend in a 4-4-2 mid block?
Well, I was about to say that would you rather have Hector Bellerin pseudo defending for 60% of the time, or would you rather have defending him for his life on 3 occasions, right?
Exactly.
He was defending for
Exactly.
his life 3 times and he got beat horribly twice, as opposed to, yeah, if you have Hector Bellerin, you're giving him 60% or 65% of the time to make a mistake. And Bellerin is going to make a mistake in that time because, I mean, as what we've seen, I mean, Bellerin was not ready for that game against Bayern Munich, the second one. And I mean, not to say that game mattered because Barcelona already had the Champions League, but yeah, Bellerin certainly wasn't there. And I mean, this is kind of the last idea too, Jaleel, about assigning blame here, right? And this is kind of what we're kind of dancing around, and what I
Mm.
think is impossible because again, there's no number percentage where it's like, oh, that Inter loss was 40 or 42% against Xavi. It was 30%. Well, that's too high already, but it was 18 against Xavi blame wise. It was 18 for Pique. It was 14 for Busquets. You know what I mean? We're not doing that. But, sometimes Xavi does get it wrong. Like I
Hmm.
said in the first match against Inter Milan, he got it wrong by starting Marcos Alonso as that left back when you're unable to, against a 5 at the back, if you're unable to go wide, especially if Inter, again, everything for them, they were numerically strong siding Dembele's side and Barcelona's right flank. So if you have nothing coming down your left flank and you're unable to get around that right fullback, he's able to tuck in and shut everything down in the middle of the field as well. And so I think Alonso was the wrong choice. It had to be Balde, and it was Alonso. And it wasn't even Alonso's fault. Like, he didn't play poorly, but it shut everything that Barcelona was trying to do on that left side against Inter the first time. But then there are all these other times especially against Bayern, both times. And you can almost argue Inter the second time and Real Madrid as well, that the quality of the player just isn't there. Be it Bellerin or Alonso or Dembele, we talked about when he's not on his day, it's bad. And then even Lewandowski, that first matchup against Bayern Munich, Lewandowski's quality wasn't what it needed to be. And that was a difference in that game, the first game against Bayern, I should say. And so I think it's interesting. It's an interesting conversation to have about Xavi because we can do this with every manager, and not just in this sport, in basketball and football, wherever, American football, I mean, or hockey, whatever, basketball, whatever. Like the how much blame and what you question of your coach. Does a coach have a locker room? Right. And I think that was the thing about Koeman, where Koeman kind of let everybody down and that he was fine enough when it came to tactics. It wasn't great, but it also wasn't as bad as people thought. But he also was fine in the locker room, but he just also didn't seem to have the ear of the players that you needed to have. So it seems like he had 70% of both of those things, which is, a failing grade. That's why his team was in ninth place to start last season. And for Xavi, it seems like I think whether he has his locker room or not, I think this Pique decision answers a lot of that. I think Pique retiring in this moment, having had a conversation with Xavi and Xavi choosing to have that conversation with him in the summer, it tells you a lot about how Xavi, controls that locker room. And I mean, I guess in essence, it's easier to have a young team that is yet to have success. It's a lot harder to kind of wrangle in all those players who've already had their success and they might feel it came under their own merit. So I think as far as does he have the locker room, I think the answer is still yes, to a degree. And then his tactics and his plan, well, that is also where I think the jury is still out. Because while, the idea would be for Xavi is if you gave him every player that does what he wants to the letter, what kind of success would Barca have, right? And I think that's a fair question to ask. That once Xavi has in January, and that'll be the difficulty too, going all the way back to Pique, that Xavi mentioned in that press conference, hey, I think the club is going to be looking for a left-footed center back in January. And that's true because one, it's a 1-to-1 as opposed to the 4-to-1 that'll be back in the summertime because of losing all that revenue from the Champions League. And two, Inigo Martinez from Athletic Club has already been linked to the club a number of times. And as I've said before, a left-footed experienced center back in the Liga who has a Spanish passport, like where there's smoke, there's fire. Like, I mean, I just believe it with those rumors. Like, that's not some name out of left field. Like when people mention, I saw in your comments where people are mentioning Frimpong, who plays at Leverkusen as a right back option, or Malo Gusto for Lyon. Like, nothing has been linked with those players. They're players who are under contract for multiple seasons. They're young. they're going to be expensive, and they're not Spanish. Those happen to have European passports, but you can't just pick a name in the world and say, oh, that player might be linked to Barcelona. But yeah, if it's an experience over 30, I mean, not over 30 in a bad way. Well, he might actually be 30. Inigo Martinez might be 28, 29. But anyway, so a player in his prime, right? In his absolute prime, who's left-footed, and then Xavi mentions in a press conference, hey, in January, we might be looking to reinforce that position. So then you kind of have to believe it. Because, again, Xavi needs players that are going to be of the quality, but also able to execute what he wants to do. And that's why when I see things like today, like Alonso potentially is going to renew for 2 years, or that Bellerin on the same day said, hey, he would like to renew at Barcelona, those kind of puzzle me a bit, because it's like, sounds like that's coming from those players' agents. Because if I'm Xavi, I looked at what Alonso did for me this year already, and I looked at what Bellerin did, and I said, absolutely not. Like, even if we bring another free transfer, maybe another free transfer might be better than what they have provided so far, because they cannot execute what I'm trying to do to the level I need it to be executed.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one whether, how much does Xavi adapt now to deal with these players that aren't at the quality that he needs,
Yeah.
knowing that he's planning for a future, which is, he clearly has a very solid idea of what he wants from in let's say 2, 3 years time from this squad. So, I mean, when it comes to assigning blame, and it's not really what I want to do because I think everything has become a blame game now in terms of, oh, we lost a football match, like you said, what percentage, should we give to everybody? Sometimes your opponents are just good at football, and
Right.
that seems to be completely forgotten in an analysis and discussion these days. Is that
100%. I love that.
y-
Yeah. That's
yeah,
why I so many times often say that, like, I mean, so many times in the league, if Barcelona don't get a result, like, can you just give Cadiz a little bit of, I know it's always Cadiz, but Cadiz a little bit of credit, or Elche a little bit of credit? It wasn't just their goalkeeper was a prime goalkeeper. It was that, like, they had a good game plan against Barca, and they executed. Even if their players weren't as good, they executed as a team. And sometimes you just have to tip your hat to your opponent, and, like, it's okay to do that. Like, you're not a coward. It doesn't make you weak to say that something
yeah.
was okay. Like, you don't have to double down on it.
And you look at the teams that Barca have struggled against this season: Inter Milan, Bayern Munich, Real Madrid. That's it.
That's it.
And
Oh, Rayo
so
Vallecano to start the year as well,
Rayo Vallecano, yeah,
who,
okay.
who actually have proven to be a top half team in the Liga. Like, they've started well, and they were good last year too in the first half of the season. So I mean,
Yeah, and like you were saying, they had a good game plan and they executed it well. It was one of those where, hats off to your opponent because they played well. But aside from that, you're seeing Barca dismantle the likes of Sevilla, dismantle Athletic Club,
well, Sevilla, I don't
dismantle,
know about Sevilla right now, but yes, Athletic Club.
yeah, okay,
Yeah,
Villarreal,
yeah,
that's no joke. I know that La Liga people will say is much poorer than it has been, and that's probably fair enough. But to get these kind of results against these teams is no joke, and that says to me that the direction that Xavi is pointing this team towards, the game model that he's implementing, when you have players that are better than your opponent, it works. Because you need players that are better than your opponent to win things. We have to take that as a prerequisite. And so when you do have those players, it's your job as a manager to set up a game plan that makes the most out of that advantage. Like, Pep's done at Man City, and all the serial winners have done. Ancelotti's managed teams that have incredible players always, and that's the primary reason why they've won things. If you then if you then add on a very consistent and um, well thought out footballing model that gives you advantages in the right places, then you're going to have a good project. And in my opinion, that's what Xavi has. He has a good footballing mind that understands, tactically against specific opponents. How do I tweak the shape slightly to get a free man here, a numerical advantage here, you know, um, and sure, he's going to make mistakes, like you said, and certainly against the Inter game with Alonso and with Raphinha playing on the left made absolutely no sense. He's learning. We have to accept that this process is involves Xavi as well. He is part of the process of learning and improving. But for my money, from what I've seen against the elite opposition, it does come down mostly to quality. And I think that's going to be the deciding factor always and or forevermore, unless you very specifically go out and counteract a certain team's way of playing. like a Rayo might do against the Barcelona, then you might have some joy. But no Barca fan wants. I mean, this is a debate that I've seen raging online actually. Is do you want more of a pragmatic manager who's willing to do that, or an idealist? I think most Barca fans want the idealist. I don't know
Yep.
about you.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think the truth came through with Ernesto Valverde to answer that question.
Yeah,
That,
exactly.
right? I mean, that was the answer to that. That Ernesto Valverde won 2 La Ligas in a row, won the Copa del Rey, and it wasn't good enough because I think people were demanding to enjoy the football that Barcelona playing a certain way. And I think that's also like that idea, right? At the very heart of being a culé is also why the internet hates Barcelona fans so
Mm,
much, because not only have they won, but they also have I mean, you could say it's a bit of snobbery, right? They want to win in a certain way, and
hmm
they're very critical of their own success when they don't even win the way they want to win, right? And so I mean that's why Ernesto Valverde was seen as this awful manager of Barcelona when he won 2 straight La Ligas, and he won what was it, like 72 or 74% of all matches at Barcelona, and yet
Yeah.
still right, he's still like eviscerated and seen in disgust these years later. So last question then about kind of taking that idea to the next level, that with Pique, it's interesting to me that with Pique, that squad list announced, this is his final match at home against Almeria here, and you see Chadi Riyad getting promoted for the first time, and there is no, again, Pique, 14 years, club legend, all that stuff. Like there's no like replacement, or that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that seeing a young center back thing being brought up, called up in this match. So before January comes, and I mean with the World Cup the way it is, like this might be the only match this season that Chadi Riyad gets called up, because if Inigo Martinez is bought in January, then you don't, like, Riyad is probably even done at Barcelona, like in the long term, right? Because now Barca are going to have 5 center backs for the next 3 to 5 years ahead of him. So then Riyad's career is over already, right? So I just want to make people very clear of that these Barca athletic players, it's all about the opportunity you have, who's in front of you, and even if you're able to seize your opportunity. Because Riyad, to see him called up to this match is surprising to me, because when Barca Athletic have been struggling the last month, he's been struggling as well. He's been one of the worst players for Rafa Marquez. When they started so well in the first month in September, he was one of their best players. And it seems like Barca Athletic have kind of gone as he's gone this year. And he's been really good at times. And again, when they've struggled, he's defensively, it's been rough. And he didn't look ready for the Liga for the last month, but here he is, potentially to show what he has. And he also is just there in case of emergency. So I don't expect to see him in the game at all. And it's going to be a final farewell for Pique. And because they have Eric Garcia and Christensen, and even Alonso can play at the left center back position, and then Pique. So I don't expect to see Riyad. The other player there is Casado. And thinking about the Victoria Pilsen match, we saw Casado, we saw Sans come on later. And I don't think there's an easy answer to this, and I don't think it's like black and white here. But do you think it's more important for young players? And I want to use midfielders in particular. A midfielder like Casado, who from the very time I saw him for the first time with the U16s, he is very much when I say system player at Barcelona, he does everything you'd expect a Barcelona midfield to do. He doesn't have anything that makes him special in any way, but he moves the ball well. He wins tackles as a pivot, as many tackles he needs to win. He's not potentially great in the air, like any Barca pivot usually isn't very great in the air, but he gets the job done again with winning those 50-50 balls. He's very, very intelligent positionally, but he does not wow you in any way. And it seems like he can fit in Xavi's system and in the quote unquote 4-3-3 in a Barcelona system. But he, again, does not have these individual qualities that are going to make fans fall in love with him or go crazy about him. So do you think it's more important for players like a Casado to come out and just look like they fit in that system? Or do you need to see something individual from them that says they have this elite skill that Xavi can mold and Barcelona can use down the road?
I think it depends really on the makeup of the team that you're going into. So, I mean, every team is going to have some players that aren't particularly flashy or aren't particularly game changing in a lot of ways, but they perform the basics well enough that around those game changing players, they perform an important function. So, that probably would have been an apt description of Busquets, many years ago. I know Busquets obviously has so much to his game in terms of his press resistance and the way that he can move the ball and manipulate it to beat an oncoming player and things like that. Um,
But I would actually argue that Gabi is that player today. I mean, I saw Gabi at a youth level, and he was that game breaking, really special player who had more quality than everyone around him. And now his role with the first team for the last 2 seasons has been playing his role in Xavi's system to the T, to the letter. That's why he's been
Mm,
more influential in the team than Kessié was. Because
mm.
Kessié kind of came in, oh, this is the profile of a player that he is, and you have to use his skill set. And if he's not utilizing his strengths, then he's going to suffer a little bit, which he has. When Gabi, I mean, he's exactly what Xavi wants to do in that position, except he does need to add more things to his game, certainly. But again, he does exactly what Xavi asked to the letter. And actually, I think Xavi has become that position, that kind of player, as you say.
Yeah, yeah, potentially. And, again, it depends on the makeup of the team because if you're doing that and the players around you that if sorry, if you're doing that and that unlocks, something else, some space or opportunity for the players around you to create threat and score goals, then that's okay, isn't it? There's nothing wrong with being that player if it's serving the team, and it's allowing the team to be successful. And that could potentially be the case in the pivot role. Um, Frankie de Jonger's player who's obviously completely the opposite, who quite clearly brings something extra to that position that wouldn't typically be there. Um, but if it's at the cost of the fundamentals, at the basics, do you want to trust him there, for the foreseeable future? So as an academy player, if you're looking at a position that is currently, as the pivot role is for Barca, is currently um, not stocked very well, then it's very possible that just doing the basics and being good enough. I know you can't ever just be good enough at Barca, so we are talking at a certain level here. You've got to be elite at what you do. So when we say good enough, we mean you can perform this task to an elite level, but you're not delivering a 70-yard diagonal to your wing or anything like that. Um, if you can do the fundamentals of the role to an elite level, then yeah, I think in a position where, like I said, the position is understocked, he has a good shot of making a name for himself. Um, how old is Casado?
19.
Okay, so he's not crazy young. He should be able to compete physically. Um, and yeah, I mean, it's very unlikely that he gets a significant run in the first team or anything like that. But I think if he shows that he's ready and able, and that opportunity arises, because you've got to be lucky as well as a young player coming
Yep.
through, that opportunity has to be there. Somebody gets injured, or there's gap in the squad or whatever, and he steps up and he does a job, and when he does a job, the team wins, then he'll stay there. It's that simple. Um, so I think that's answered your question.
Yeah, I think it did. I mean, Xavi clearly liked him enough to have him in the preseason before the team left for the U.S. He had him in the preseason. Actually, he played him at right back too. There's some versatility with him, and every squad does need guys number 23, 24, 25. And, as I always say, I mean, Barcelona seems to, in recent seasons, be able to find players 8 through 16, right? Like they can find the
Hmm.
players that reinforce the squad and elevate. But obviously, other than Messi, who was one for a long time, the level of players 3 through 6 was concerning the last few seasons. And
Mm,
then especially the last 2 years now, the numbers 22 through 25, especially last year, it was non-existent. It completely dropped off into an abyss. So, yeah, as far as the Frankie de Jong question goes, Jaleel, that is a show for another time. So I want
oh
to
yeah.
continue to give us stuff to talk about in the future, and that'll be one, especially at the pivot position, that you and I could do a whole show on individual. I think people would love to hear that in the future. So anyway, Jaleel, you can find him. That's kind of the last time I'm going to say Jaleel, because it's the Purist from here on out. When you're looking him up, when you're finding him on social media, when you're especially finding him on YouTube, because congratulations, you have, I think, 400 less videos than me on YouTube in 4 less years, and yet you've already exceeded my subscriber count. So clearly you're doing something right on YouTube. So yeah, definitely check him out on YouTube. Follow the links through the show notes below through his Twitter, and you can find him on social media, as I said, and especially follow his YouTube stuff, and coming out with tremendous content on a very regular schedule as well. So thanks so much for coming on the show, The Purist, as I said, and yeah, we'll catch everybody soon. So again, Twitter and Instagram for us too, the Barcelona Pod, Close Facebook group, Patreon. We're on YouTube as well, as I said. Maybe I'd like to have it be a competition, the Purists. I'd like it to be neck and neck, right, as you and I both go on YouTube. So, well, hopefully we can get some friendly competition there as the World Cup gets underway soon. But we still have 2 Barca games left to go, including one tomorrow. So, most importantly, check in back with us as we continue to do Barca content for next week. But Thanks so much for listening to the show. Till next time, we'll talk to you soon. And Forza Barca.